The folder she left behind had his name on the tab, written in her handwriting, which was the part that stayed with him longest. Not the meeting itself. Not the lawyer sitting across the table in that glass-walled office on King Street West, explaining in careful, bloodless language what Priya had decided to pursue. Not even the stack of documents she had clearly spent months preparing, while Evan made school lunches and drove carpool routes, and believed, in the specific way tired people believe things, that their marriage was simply going through a difficult season. The folder. His name on the tab. The fact that she had labeled it. Evan Marsh set down his pen after signing the one document Sandra, his own lawyer, cold and competent in exactly the way he needed, had told him to sign. The consent to the dissolution, nothing else. He did not look at Priya when he rose. He looked at his daughter, who was 7 years old and asleep against his shoulder, with her fingers curled into the lapel of his jacket, and he carried her out into the gray November afternoon without a word. Everyone in that room believed they had just watched a man lose everything. The story did not begin in that office on King Street. It began 3 years earlier in a rented house in Hamilton, Ontario, in the converted back bedroom that Evan had turned into a workspace, after the company he'd spent 8 years building with 2 university friends had dissolved quietly and without drama. The way most things do when the money simply stops. He was 39 at the time. Priya was 34, and already well into her second year as a regional director for a pharmaceutical distribution firm, moving through meetings and airports with the particular ease of someone who had discovered early that ambition had its own momentum. She was good at it. Evan had never resented that. What he had not understood until it was too late to matter was that she had also stopped seeing the house as something they lived in together and had begun to experience it as a base camp she tolerated. After the dissolution of the firm, Evan had taken on consulting work, supply chain optimization for mid-sized manufacturers. It was not glamorous. It did not make for interesting conversation at dinner parties. He accepted contracts when they aligned and declined them when they didn't, because declining a contract that conflicted with school pickup was not, in his mind, a sacrifice. It was just the arithmetic of raising a child when one parent traveled 4 days out of 7. Isla was 5 then. She had his tendency toward quiet, and her mother's complete certainty in all things, and she had named her stuffed rabbit Gerald, after Gerald the crossing guard at her school, and no bedtime was complete without Gerald present and properly situated. Evan knew this. He also knew which library books were overdue, which school friends had recently become less interesting to her, and exactly how many minutes of quiet she needed after a long day before she was ready to talk. Priya knew that Evan would handle it. That had been the understanding unspoken, arrived at without discussion, the way such understandings always are. In the back bedroom, after the house had gone quiet, Evan worked. He had spent the better part of 3 years designing a logistics intelligence tool, a platform that allowed smaller manufacturers to run their supply chain decisions through a predictive model rather than spreadsheets and gut feeling. He had started it as a consulting side project and something to demonstrate to Fort Client. It had stopped being a side project, and become the thing itself. He paid for the infrastructure from his own account, the one that held what remained of a small inheritance from his father's estate, kept separate from their joint finances from the beginning. Not out of suspicion, out of a habit of tidiness that he could not have defended if asked to, and never had been. The intellectual property was registered to him alone. The servers, the licenses, the 2 years of incremental builds, all of it funded from one source and one source only, with timestamps and receipts that sat in folders in the back bedroom, meticulously organized. Because Evan was a man who organized things. Priya never asked what he was building. There had been a time when she might have. That time had passed. The evening she told him she wanted a divorce. She had come in from a flight from Calgary, dropped her bag on the kitchen bench, and delivered the news in a tone so measured and prepared that he understood immediately she had been deciding for a long time. There was no heat in it, no cruelty either, just the clean, flat delivery of an outcome. She had already spoken to a lawyer. She was not, she said, interested in dragging it out. They had simply grown into different people, going in different directions. Evan stood at the counter and listened, and understood two things. The first was that she was not asking him anything. The second was the name that had been appearing on her phone with a frequency he had not gone looking for but could not avoid. Given that she had simply stopped angling the screen away. Someone from a conference. No, someone introduced once in passing as a business contact. A name that arrived in the evenings and early mornings with the consistency of a subscription. He did not say the name. He did not raise his voice. He went to check on Isla. And later that night, when the house was quiet, he went to the back bedroom and turned on the monitor and sat for a long time in front of the platform without doing anything at all. The proposal her lawyers sent the following week was written with a precision that made him feel briefly as though the floor had shifted. Priya would retain the house. She would receive the primary marital assets, and she would have primary custody of Isla with Evan's time structured into 2 weekends per month and a standing Tuesday evening. The legal language was calm and thorough. A man with no fixed employment contract, no provable income of substance. A consulting practice that showed irregular earnings and no institutional stability. A man like that, the document implied without ever saying it, should be grateful for the schedule he was being offered. A man like that should understand that the child's interests required a stable primary home. He read it at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning, while Isla sat across from him drawing horses, narrating their names and personalities in a running commentary that required no response, just his presence. He set the document down and watched his daughter draw. On paper, they were right. That was what made it hard to breathe. The invisible work, the lunches, the routes, the library books, the rabbit named Gerald, left no record a custody hearing could weigh. For 3 days, Evan considered the easy version. Sign, absorb the loss, take the weekends. Avoid a legal war he had no obvious resources to win. There was a kind of dignity available in that option, if you looked at it a certain way. The dignity of a man who chose not to make things harder for his child. What changed was a Saturday morning in late December. Evan had taken Isla to the rink at Bayfront Park, the outdoor one, where the ice was never quite perfect and the rental skates took too long to lace, and she complained about both things with the joyful conviction of a child who expects all complaints to be received with love. He held her hand while she found her balance, and at some point she stopped needing the hand but kept holding it, which he noticed and did not mention. On the drive home, the heater running and the windows fogging at the edges, she fell quiet in the back seat. Then she said, in the particular tone children use for questions that are not really questions, "Dad, are you going to move away?" He kept his eyes on the road. "No, Maisie's dad moved to Edmonton." "I know, Bud. Are you going to move to Edmonton?" "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I'll be here. That's a promise." She absorbed this. The radio played something he didn't recognize. Outside, Hamilton looked gray and ordinary and entirely itself, and Evan felt the sentence he had just said settle somewhere in his chest like something physical. He would not sign those terms. He was not going to be the reason the answer to that question ever changed. 2 days later, after the school drop-off, he sat in the car in the empty lot beside the Tim Hortons on Barton Street and made a call he had been circling for a week. One name had come back from every conversation he'd quietly had about family law in the province. A lawyer out of Toronto, reputation preceding her like weather. The line picked up on the second ring. Beaumont. The voice was direct, not unkind. The voice of someone who had already decided what her time was worth and was waiting to learn if you understood the same. "My name is Evan Marsh," he said. "I think my wife's lawyers are about to argue that because I stayed home with my daughter, I don't deserve to keep her." A pause, not uncertainty. Assessment. That's a precise way to put it. It's a precise situation. "Come to my office Friday morning. Bring everything you have. Financial records, the proposal, anything in writing. And Mr. Marsh," she paused, and in the pause there was the suggestion of something almost dry. "Don't agree to anything before we talk. Not a school newsletter." He sat in the parking lot for another minute after the call ended, and watched the Tim Hortons drive-through queue inch forward in the cold. That evening he made pasta because it was Isla's standard request, and he listened to 20 minutes of analysis regarding which of her classmates had the best winter boots and why. He did the dishes. He found Gerald and placed him correctly, and only after the house had gone, still did he walk down the hall to the back bedroom and turn on the monitor. The platform sat where he had left it, the thing he had built quietly over 3 years in borrowed hours, with his own money, under his own name. He sat down in front of it and thought, for the first time with real clarity, about what it might actually be worth. He didn't know yet. He only knew what he had promised in a car on the way home from a skating rink, and he was not a man who made promises he didn't intend to keep. Beaumont's office was on the 32nd floor of a building in the financial district, with a view that left nowhere to hide. She read the proposal in full, without expression, then squared it on the desk and looked at him the way someone looks at a structure they are about to assess for foundational problems. "On paper," she said, "you are not a strong case." He had braced for something softer. The directness was a relief. She walked him through exactly what opposing counsel would do, not attack him as a father, because that was unsophisticated, but frame him as a dependent. A man whose domestic contributions, however real, were impossible to quantify in a courtroom. Warm language, sympathetic language, and underneath it, the clean suggestion that a child deserved a home with a parent who could be counted on financially. "They'll make it sound like they're protecting Isla," she said. "That's what makes it effective." Then she asked about the platform, not the technical architecture. What a judge would need to understand, when, how, and whose money, so he told her. The inheritance, kept separate before the marriage, never folded into their joint account, never spent on shared expenses. The account that bore only his name, the servers, the licenses, the IP registration, all traceable to that account. The 3 years of work done in the hours after his daughter was asleep outside the shared life of the marriage, with separate funds. Beaumont listened without writing anything down. "That's better than you know," she said, "but here's where we stand. Ontario divides net family property, not community property the way the Americans do it, but the default assumption is still that what you built during the marriage belongs to the marital calculation. The value of that platform, as it stands, would ordinarily enter the table. What you've just described is the argument that it shouldn't. Every piece of it, the separate funds, the separate account, the IP registration, is a building block. My job is to build that argument before they can dismantle it." She fixed him with a flat, even look, "which means I need everything, every receipt, every timestamp, every bank statement. We don't walk into that courtroom with a story. We walk in with a record." Before he left, she gave him one instruction he hadn't expected. "Consent to the divorce," she said. "Sign that portion and only that. Don't contest the dissolution itself. You have no interest in it, and contesting it makes you look like a man fighting to hold onto a woman who's leaving, which does not help you. The house, the assets, the custody, you give them nothing. But you sign the divorce consent cleanly and let them spend the next month believing you've already accepted the outcome. Let them underestimate you," she said. "It's the only free advantage available, and it costs you nothing." 3 weeks later, in the glass-walled office on King Street, that was exactly what he did. Signed the consent to dissolution, nothing more, with Isla asleep on his shoulder and everyone in that room reading it as the posture of a man who had already surrendered the rest. He had conceded nothing that mattered. The months that followed arrived as a kind of sustained pressure, applied politely and without pause. Priya's sighed. Resourced, it became clear, with the kind of institutional backing that came from a firm that employed its own legal department, never raised its voice. It simply worked on the structure of the situation from every available angle. A psychological evaluation was requested and framed as routine procedure. Standard language, careful phrasing, a perfectly reasonable request that happened to carry the implication, hanging in the air like cold, that a man who had built his life around a child might be worth examining more closely. The evaluation itself was not the damage. The implication was, and there was no clean way to object to it without making the implication seem more credible. Then the time with Isla began to erode. A pickup moved from Saturday to Sunday without explanation. A weekend canceled. Isla had a cold, he was told, though when he called she sounded entirely fine and asked him 3 times what they were going to do next week. Each instance taken alone was reasonable. Together, they were a lesson. A slow and methodical demonstration of what continued opposition would cost him and how long he would have to pay it. He did not stop, but he slept less. The thing that changed the shape of the war arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in Beaumont's office, delivered in a single sentence while she was reading something on her screen. Mr. Marsh. Were you aware that someone has made an offer to acquire your platform? He went very still. I wasn't. She turned the monitor. A venture capital firm out of Vancouver, Hartwell Group, had submitted a letter of interest to acquire the platform. The valuation they had floated was in 7 figures, preliminary, unsigned, unpublished, but real. Did you solicit this? No. His voice was quiet. I posted the core architecture as an open repository under my name to test whether it held up publicly. I wasn't pitching it to anyone. I was going to finalize the build before. He stopped. He had been going to say before I decided what to do with it. The irony arrived a half-second too late. Beaumont was watching his face. Here is what I want you to consider, she said. I have been doing this work for 18 years, and I have learned to distrust coincidence in divorce proceedings. She pulled up a second screen, then a third. Your wife filed on a particular date. I have the timestamps on the proposal and the earliest correspondence between her lawyers and her firm's legal team. And I have been tracing the movements of a Mr. Scott Leonard, her business contact, through the same investment circles that produced this offer. You're saying she knew about the platform. I'm saying she moved faster than the collapse of a quiet marriage requires. Beaumont's voice did not rise. It went precise, which was worse. She didn't learn about your good fortune and then react. She filed before the acquisition interest could surface, because the moment it surfaces, it becomes an asset on the table. One she'd have to fight for openly with a judge watching. Far simpler to finalize quickly, while you're still the man with no income and an irregular consulting record, before anyone looks at what you've been building at midnight for 3 years. Evan sat with it. He had been carrying himself like a man absorbing an injustice, a father who had done the work no one could see, taking the loss because decent people absorbed losses. He had even allowed himself a measure of self-pity in the dark hours and had been ashamed of it. But that was not the story. It had never been the story. Priya hadn't left because he was a man going nowhere. She had left because she had understood, through some proximity to the right conversations, that he was a man about to arrive, and she wanted to be in the right position before that happened. He was not a husband being set aside. He was an asset being quietly moved off the table by someone who knew its value and was betting he didn't. The self-pity left him completely. Okay, he said. Okay, Beaumont agreed. And for the first time since he had known her, something at the corner of her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not warmth exactly, but acknowledgement. The escalation, when it came, was elegant and hard to counter. Through Scott Leonard and the ordinary social machinery of people who knew the right people, a soft fog of doubt began drifting through the investment community. Nothing formal, nothing traceable, not easily. Questions raised in conversation. Was the founder in the middle of a contested proceeding? Were there unresolved ownership questions around the IP? A prudent firm might want to wait for the dust to settle. It was exactly the corporate equivalent of the psychological evaluation, an unanswerable insinuation, planted to grow. And then, on a Thursday evening, Priya came to the apartment. Evan had taken a furnished place in Stony Creek for the duration. 2 bedrooms, a narrow galley kitchen. A view of the escarpment if you stood at the right angle. He was at the table reviewing documents when the knock came. Isla was asleep in the other room. Priya stood in the doorway in her work coat, composed, and Evan understood immediately that she had not come to revisit anything. She had come to close. He stepped back to let her in because Isla was sleeping, and he would not have this conversation on the landing. She looked around the apartment with an expression that was almost gentle. A careful, practiced kind of sympathy, the expression of someone delivering a verdict they have already made peace with. He would sign a comprehensive settlement. Walk away from the custody dispute. Accept a reasonable cash figure. In exchange, the pressure on the acquisition would lift. Hartwell would get their clean deal. Everyone would get something. "You are a good father, Evan," she said, and she meant it, he believed, which was what made it impossible to answer. "That is genuinely true. But this is not a room you were built to stand in. Let this go before it costs you more than you have." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened the door. She recalculated him with her eyes, adjusted something in herself, and left. Her heels were quiet on the concrete. The door clicked shut. He sat alone at the table in the Stony Creek apartment for a long time that night. The doubt arrived, and he let it come, because he had learned not to lie to himself when it was dark. He thought about what it would mean to put Isla through the slow, grinding machinery of a fight this size. The lawyers, the evaluations, the canceled weekends, the long uncertainty of it, set against the possibility that he would still lose. A 6-figure platform and a 7-figure offer, and a record as clean as any lawyer could ask for, and none of it was a guarantee. He thought about what Isla would choose if she could, a father who won, or a father who was simply reliably there. He did not have an answer by morning. He only had the work and what he had said on the drive home from the skating rink. He kept going. The bottom came 8 days before the hearing. A technology newsletter, the kind of publication that circulated in startup and VC circles in Vancouver and Toronto, ran a short item about the Hartwell Group's interest in a Hamilton-based logistics platform. The item was inaccurate in its framing and precise in its damage, describing the project as carrying unresolved IP questions connected to ongoing family law proceedings. It read like reporting and functioned like sabotage. Within 48 hours, Hartwell's team had requested a pause pending their own due diligence review. The same morning, a supplemental motion arrived from Priya's side. An application to freeze all assets connected to the software platform pending the resolution of the family law matter. If granted, it would lock the one thing that demonstrated Evan's financial standing inside a legal hold until long after the custody question had been decided. Beaumont called at noon. "If they get the freeze," she said with no opening softness, "the acquisition stalls indefinitely, and we're back to where they wanted you from the beginning. A man with an irregular income and nothing a judge can weigh, fighting for his daughter on their terms." She let that sit. "I won't tell you it's over, but it's not good." He stood at the window of the Stony Creek apartment and looked at the escarpment. "There's one more thing," she said, and her tone shifted by the degree he had learned to listen for. "I've been tracing the source of that newsletter item, the specific language, the framing about unresolved IP, the tie to the family proceedings. That phrasing existed in exactly 2 places. It was known to your wife, and it was known to Scott Leonard." Mas? Someone handed that story to a journalist, Mr. Marsh, and there aren't many hands it could have passed through. He watched the gray afternoon light on the rock face of the escarpment. "Then we find whose hand it was," he said. "We already know," Beaumont said. "Now we prove it." Outside, it was the kind of November afternoon that has no opinion about anything. The morning of the hearing was clear and cold. The sky over Hamilton, that particular hard blue that comes in the first week of winter when the temperature drops and the air runs clean. Evan had been awake since 5. He had laid out his clothes the night before, the good jacket, the one he wore to the kind of meetings that had consequences, and made Isla's breakfast, and walked her to the neighbor down the street who would watch her for the day. He had crouched at the door to zip her coat, and told her he would be back before dinner. Then he stood at the curb of the Stony Creek apartment and waited, because Beaumont had told him only that a car would come. What came was a black Range Rover, unhurried and clean, and the man behind the wheel was not a driver. Evan knew the name without knowing the face. Duncan Harwell. Not Hartwell the firm, but the man at the center of it, the founding partner, who had taken 3 companies from idea to acquisition before he turned 50 and had stopped taking meetings he didn't choose personally. Evan had assumed in the way you assume things about people who operate at that scale, that they did not appear in parking lots in Stony Creek on a Tuesday morning for one man's family court case. The passenger window came down. "Get in," Hartwell said. "I want to be in front of that building when the cameras are looking." Evan got in. They drove for several minutes without speaking, the city moving past the glass in the particular gray-blue of a Hamilton winter morning. Then Hartwell said, without looking over, "My operations lead kept pulling up the same repository, said it was the cleanest logistics architecture he'd reviewed in 2 years, and the man who built it had posted it publicly under his own name, without a pitch deck, or a teaser, or a single message to anyone." He paused. "Nobody who's trying to sell me something does that. I wanted to know what kind of person builds something real, and then just leaves it in the open." A few blocks from the courthouse, Hartwell pulled to the curb and put the car in park. "You drive it in," he said. He opened the door and came around to the passenger side. "You should be behind the wheel when you pull up, and it won't hurt for certain people on those steps to see who gets out of the passenger seat." Evan sat with the offer for a moment, understood the shape of it, the tactical intelligence wrapped inside the straightforward gesture. Then he slid behind the wheel. There were cameras on the steps of the John Sapinka Courthouse on Main Street when the Range Rover turned the corner and rolled to a stop. The acquisition had leaked into the business press, and a 7-figure deal tangled in a family court proceeding was a story that moved itself along without much help. Priya's lead lawyer was climbing the steps with a file accordion under one arm. Scott Leonard was near the top of the steps with his hands in his pockets, watching the entrance the way a man watches something he believes is already arranged. The door opened and Evan Marsh stepped out. The man with the irregular consulting record. The dependent father. The husband who had signed the dissolution papers with his daughter, asleep on his shoulder, and walked out into the gray November afternoon with nothing. He stood in the morning light, unhurried, buttoned his jacket. Duncan Hartwell came around from the passenger's side a beat later, and that was the detail that landed, because the journalist who recognized the name began saying it, and the name moved up the steps quickly. Leonard saw it. Evan watched the arithmetic move across his face. The sudden, queasy recalculation of a man realizing the arrangement he had understood contained variables no one had told him about. He turned and walked back through the courthouse doors without waiting for anyone. Evan did not watch him go for long. He walked up the steps and through the doors. Inside, the hearing room was formal and quiet. The judge was older, with the particular patience of someone who had watched many people perform certainty and had learned to wait for it to run out. Priya's team led well. The story they told was sophisticated and compassionate. A devoted but financially unstable home environment, a mother prepared to offer structure and continuity, a father whose contributions, however genuine, were difficult to evaluate against the needs of a 7-year-old girl. They were good. They believed the case they were making. And for the first 40 minutes, Evan sat still and let them make it. Then it was Beaumont's turn. She did not raise her voice. She began with dates. She laid down, document by document, the precise chronology of the dissolution. When Priya had filed, when the earliest correspondence between her lawyers and her firm's legal team had occurred, and set against that, the earliest traceable contact between the Hartwell Group and anyone in proximity to the platform. The two timelines sat side by side on the record like a statement. Priya had not reacted to the acquisition interest. She had moved ahead of it, filed deliberately while the asset was still invisible before it could surface and demand to be divided in an open proceeding. The applicant did not discover this project late. Beaumont told the court in the measured tone of someone reading a weather report. She discovered it early, and the timing of this proceeding was structured around ensuring it remained invisible until after the primary questions had been settled. The objection came. The judge allowed Beaumont to continue. Then came the newsletter item. Beaumont produced the trail her team had reconstructed over 6 days. The specific language, the particular framing about IP complications, the precise publication timing. Language that existed in exactly 2 informed sources, and a documented connection between one of those sources and the contact who had placed the story, timed to do maximum damage to the acquisition and, by consequence, to the only concrete evidence of Evan's financial standing. The disruption to this acquisition process, Beaumont said, was not market caution. It was manufacture, and the record establishes the manufacture. A change moved through the room. Priya's lawyers began, in the quiet way of people whose foundation has shifted beneath them, to disagree with each other in low voices. The small, tense whispers of a team that had discovered something in its own case it had not fully examined. Beaumont closed the asset question with precision. The inheritance received before the marriage, the account that had never commingled with joint funds, the servers and licenses purchased from that account alone, the IP registration in Evan's name, predating any offer. The work performed in the hours after the house had gone quiet, outside the shared life of the marriage, funded by separate money, built by one set of hands. Ontario family law began from the presumption that assets accumulated during the marriage entered the net family property calculation. Beaumont acknowledged the presumption plainly. Then she dismantled it piece by documented piece until the presumption could not stand against the record. This was not built with family resources, she said. It was not built during family time in any meaningful sense. It was not built with family knowledge, and the attempt to freeze it was an attempt to include something that was never part of the family estate. The room was quiet when she sat. The judge set aside the files and looked at Evan directly. "Mr. Marsh," he said, "setting the financial questions aside, and we will set them aside for a moment. Tell me why you are asking for primary custody of your daughter." Evan stood. He did not reach for the platform or the acquisition or the record Beaumont had just constructed. None of it was the point. It had never been the point. "A few months ago," he said, "I took my daughter skating at Bayfront Park. On the way home, she asked me from the back seat if I was going to move away." He paused, not for effect, because the memory required it. She wasn't being dramatic. She was 7. She'd heard that her friend's dad had moved to Edmonton. She just wanted to know. His voice was steady. "I told her I wasn't going anywhere, and I meant it, and I've meant it every day since then. I'm not asking for primary custody because of what I built in that back bedroom. I'm asking because I'm the one who has been there. For the library books and the skating rink and the stuffed rabbit she cannot sleep without. I know that doesn't have a number beside it. I know it's hard to weigh, but I promised her I would be here, and I'd like the court's help in keeping that promise." No one said anything. The judge looked at him for a moment. Then he made a note. The rulings came in order. The motion to freeze the platform assets was denied. The acquisition, the court found, was not subject to obstruction by the proceedings. On the question of the platform itself, separate property, developed outside the marriage with separate funds, registered and maintained independently. The net family property calculation would account for the genuine marital estate and nothing beyond it. On custody, primary custody to Evan Marsh, with a regular and clearly defined access schedule for Priya. Evan watched his ex-wife receive this without expression. She had walked into the proceeding, holding what she believed was every card. The stillness in her face was the only evidence of what it cost her to find out she had been wrong. Outside on the courthouse steps, the November air was hard and clean. Duncan Hartwell was waiting with his collar up against the cold. "I want to tell you something," Hartwell said. He offered his hand and Evan took it. "I didn't come this morning because of the platform. I'd already decided on the platform. I came because my operations lead told me you'd posted your best work publicly, under your real name, with no one to pitch to." He held the handshake. "I wanted to see how you carried yourself when it mattered. People tell you everything when the stakes are real." He let go. "Welcome to the deal, Mr. Marsh. We'll get the paperwork finished this week." The acquisition closed in January. Evan did not mark the occasion. He did not post about it or tell many people or do anything that would have looked from the outside like a man celebrating. What he did was find a house, a small 2-story in Dundas, backing onto the conservation area, with a yard that needed work and a porch that needed painting and a room that could become whatever Isla needed it to be. It was his, and it was hers. That was the full measure of what it needed to be. The first night in the house, he did what he had always done. Made dinner, helped with the reading worksheet at the kitchen table, found Gerald and placed him correctly in the bed. And after the house had gone quiet and settled around them, the way a house does when it's been slept in the first time, he carried a cup of tea to the back porch and sat alone in the January dark, and let himself feel the specific, undramatic weight of having kept his word. He saw Priya in March, at Isla's school concert. Folding chairs and a low gymnasium stage, and children in construction paper costumes, performing a song about the seasons. She was as composed as always, though there was something in her eyes that had not been there before, a particular kind of tired that polish doesn't reach. He had heard, in the quiet way these things travel, that whatever had existed between her and Scott Leonard had not survived the exposure. He did not take satisfaction in that, which still surprised him a little when he was honest about it. They stood near the back wall after the performance and traded a few sentences about Isla's schedule, about a permission form for a March break program, about whether the spring parent-teacher nights had been sent home yet. No heat in it. Two people who shared a daughter and had long since run out of anything else. When the parents began collecting their children, Priya turned to leave, then stopped. "I knew you were working on something," she said quietly. I didn't know what it was." Evan looked at her. There were things he could have said. He had spent several months composing some of them in his head, late at night in the furnished apartment in Stony Creek. He did not say any of them. "I know," he said. He crossed the gymnasium to where Isla was waiting, holding a paper leaf she had made in art class, slightly crushed from being carried around all evening. He took her hand and she held up the leaf and said it was a sugar maple because they had studied sugar maples this term, and sugar maples were the most important tree in Canada. Actually, he agreed that this was almost certainly true. They walked out into the March evening, the two of them, the air still cold but different from January. The cold that carries something underneath it, something beginning. There was no victory in it, no arrival. Just a father and his daughter walking to the car, her hand in his, Gerald waiting at home in the right place on the right bed, and the ordinary dark of a Tuesday evening in Dundas that belonged, quietly and entirely, to them.